excited to hear this lecture, and I'm sure you are as well, so I'm just going to quickly introduce Brien so we can get started. Very excited.
He needs no introduction. He needs no introduction.
He needs no introduction, so thanks, Brien. Let's
That's his name.
Thank you. So this is my, I've written 2 books on elongated skulls, and this is the version in Portuguese, which was done about a year ago, and the portrayal of that skull is based on an actual Baracus skull. The proportions have not been altered or anything. The artist is Marcia Moore, and she's a fine artist, but now she's getting into forensics. So she takes photographs that I sent her, and then she simply fleshes out what she sees. She doesn't try to put any interpretation as to whether it's Native American or whatever. She just says, this is what I see when I look at when I build the face. So this is the actual book that I wrote about the elongated skulls, specifically of Peru and Bolivia, because they are found in different parts of the world, but the major concentration is in Peru and Bolivia. But there's more. David Childress and I wrote this book about 5 years ago. It covered the basic concept of cranial deformation from around the world. And this is my book about, it's quite a short book, but it's a book I wrote about Akhenaten because he's the only pharaoh that I find interesting. The others are like, I just don't find them interesting, but he's a very fascinating character for a bunch of different reasons. And this is the book that I'm presently writing, which is about the DNA results, which seems to connect elongated skulls of the Black Sea with the coast of Peru, which sounds odd, but that's where the DNA is pointing. Is Dr. Carl here? Good. Dr. Carl is a geneticist, so I'm sure he'll find this interesting. So I dedicate this to my mentor, Senior Juan Navarro, who knew more about the ancient cultures of the coast of Peru than any academic. He was an amateur, but he had been studying and collecting artifacts for more than 40 years. And it was in his museum that I first saw my first elongated skull in reality. We've all seen photographs on Ancient Aliens and In Search Of and shows like that where they say they're Nephilim or Anunnaki or whatever, which is all conjecture. So it was he that I spent 8 years with, almost every day with Senior Juan.
Wow.
He showed me every ancient Baracus site that existed. Every Sunday we would rent a taxi and I'd say, where are we going? He'd say, well, we're going to Carwas. It's like 3 hours this way through the desert. So he's what took me on this path. And this is Senior Juan with a baby elongated skull. And notice the hair color. It's a crimson color. And we were able to find out that that hair color was genetically of the Baracus people of the coast of Peru. Now, Native American people are supposed to have black hair in general, dark skin, and so that's one of the anomalies. We purchased a bunch of skulls from local people. They would literally come to the museum with, these were tomb robbers, but we set up a policy that we wanted to purchase them directly, otherwise they'd wind up out of the country as curiosities. And so an elongated skull of Baracus can get on the black market $1,000 to $1,500, but we paid them like $40, and that ensured that these artifacts stayed in Peru, and in fact stayed in their homeland. So cradle headboarding is what many different cultures around the world did. It was always the nobility of a culture that would do that, whether it was in Melanesia or in Europe or different parts of the world amongst the Maya. Only the nobility had their babies' heads cranially deformed, and it was a way in order to distinguish them physically from the commoners. So when you saw someone like that, you'd say, oh, that's a person of nobility. And so these are examples on the left side. That's from the 20th century. That's some tribal people living in the Ucayali region of the jungle of Peru. You can see how the board is strapped onto the baby's head. And then the middle one is a lady from the west coast of Canada, from Vancouver Island. And then the one on the right is literally tribes called the Flathead people, because they would deform their heads. But this is what we find more in Peru, these two different shapes. You see the almost domed shape, or heart shape, and then the elongated shape. And most academics believe that the different shapes responded to different levels of nobility. So the chiefly people would have a certain shape, and then probably the religious people would have a different shape. And again, that's a way to easily distinguish, oh, that's a person of faith, or oh, that's the high chief. And the Inca did have elongated heads, but it was banished when the Spanish entered Cusco and they saw people like that. They said, why do they look like that? And they were told, well, we bind the baby's heads. And they said, you're not doing that anymore. So they made it illegal, and then the Inca resisted, and then a much stricter law was enforced. And so that's when head binding amongst the Inca people stopped. So this one on the left, that's a classic Baracus shape. And they are the largest elongated skulls in the world. And this is the standard in one of the Cusco museums of how supposedly the head shape was achieved. But we're going to see that it's much more complicated than that. So different cultures, averaging about 2,000 years ago, performed this practice. You have the mound builders, people of the Andes, the Maya, the megalith builders of Europe, the Han, and Melanesians, and people in Africa as well. And there's no necessary reason that any of these people were in contact with each other to do that. It's possible that the mound builders and maybe the Maya were in a relationship. But it's just you have these many different cultures, and the three questions asked of descendants who still exist about why their ancestors did this is A, we think it's very aesthetic. We like the look of it looks noble, so we like to do that. B, we think it makes our children more intelligent. And the most curious thing is C, this is what the ancestors looked like. So they're mimicking their ancestors. And that's where the Baracus are the most interesting of them all. So, I'm going to start with Akhenaten because there are so many false statements, I believe, stated about him, because automatically when you say elongated skull, they go, Akhenaten had an elongated head. And it's like, well, did he? And so, my knowledge about Akhenaten is based on Abdel Hakim and Stephen, who laid the groundwork for my interest in the so-called heretic pharaoh, who was actually, I think, a great hero of ancient Egypt, because he was very, very, very clever man, and he did things in defiance of what was happening to his royal family. So, of course, there he is, and this is in the Cairo Museum. And, of course, he looks like Stuart Copeland of the band The Police. But you see, compared to the other pharaohs, his facial features are very, very different. And some would say almost androgynous. And of course, the great loving relationship was between Nefertiti and Akhenaten. And the tragedy was that his father, Amenhotep III, was under complete control of the Amen priesthood. So they would say to him, you know, you're the pharaoh, don't worry, you don't have to do anything. Just enjoy yourself in the palace. We're in control of the economy and politics and warfare and anything like that. You don't need to do anything. And so it's like, oh, I thought I was the pharaoh. No, don't worry about it. But as Amenhotep IV was growing up, who was Akhenaten, he got really pissed off with this, because he said, what is this? I'm of divine right, but I have no right to do anything. This is not acceptable. And so he was a student of the great mystery schools. He knew a lot about his own history, and that's what he started to enforce as he came into power. The first thing, or one of the first things he did, is he changed his name from Amenhotep IV, which means the peace of Amen.
Amenhotep IV. Well, it's the harmony.
Oh, harmony, okay, harmony with Amen. But he was not in harmony with Amen, because the Amen priesthood were the controllers of the entire society. And there are 5 lessons, again, 5 stages of any given day. So you start with, which is it, what's the first one?
The 5 stages?
Yeah.
Kepper.
Oh, Kepper, which is the dung beetle moving the ball of dung up the hill. That's the sun starting to rise in the sky. Then you have Ra, which is the 2nd stage. So most Egyptologists say the name of the sun was Ra, but when you get the deeper teachings, it's one stage of the day. So this is the sun rising in the sky. Then you have Un, which is midday.
Shadowless consciousness.
Sorry?
Shadowless.
Shadowless consciousness. And then you have Aten, which is the highest level of consciousness and the brightest time of the day. And then you have Amen, which is twilight descending into darkness. So those are also philosophical, metaphysical principles, and they correspond to 5 stages of your life. So the first stage is when you're a baby. The 2nd stage of Ra is when you're a teenager and you're fighting against the system. Then you have Un. Then you have Aten, which is where we are, basically. We're at the highest stage of our development in this life, because physically we're still quite strong, mentally we're still with it. And then Amen is when you are descending into older age. And Amen from the Bible comes from Amen. And it doesn't mean let thy will be done. It means let it remain in darkness. So that shows you how the Catholic Church and the Amen priesthood were the controllers of knowledge. Because when they would say Amen to people, what they were saying is, you're not going to learn what I know. But if you come to me and you pay me, then I'll take care of any affairs you require. And that's where the concept of death began, because before that there was no concept of death. You went west because you related to the sun. As the sun went down, you went with it. And you have that in the Polynesian cultures too. The spirit, when the spirit would leave the body, it would go to the west, to the homeland. So you see all of the artifacts that we'll see from the time of Akhenaten have their noses knocked off, or they're broken, or shattered, or scratched, or whatever. That was the Amen priesthood trying to destroy any evidence that these people ever existed. And so that's why he's also missing from some of the great kings lists. All of a sudden, it skips over him and Hatshepsut as well.
Absolutely.
So that's, he was very powerful and defiant, but his demise came at the hands of the priests, who then took the power back again. And so his lineage, again, goes from Amenhotep III to him. He changed his name to Akhenaten, which means the shadow of Aten. So what he was trying to do was he was trying to bring back the full consciousness period. And so he didn't invent monotheism. The ancient system was that every aspect was a part of the whole. So that goes back thousands upon thousands upon thousands of years to the time of Aten, which is highest level of consciousness, where every component fits into the whole. There is no separation of anything. So he called himself the shadow because he was trying to bring back the light. And again, you have these figures and you say, well, was he alien or was he androgynous? He didn't necessarily look like this, but what he told his sculptors, which was very unique, was, portray me as I am. He was so confident about himself that he didn't say, make me look, powerful and make me 20 feet tall or something. He said, I don't care, look, I'm an evolved person. I don't care how you portray me. I have other things to do. And some people think he suffered from what's called Marfan syndrome, but that's unknown at this time. But he was trying to bring back, this is one of his symbols. This This is Aten, the fullness, and all of the aspects of the rays coming out of it. So in defiance of the Amen priesthood, who again defaced any depictions of him or Nefertiti or the 6 daughters from existence, he moved the capital city. And so he moved it from Thebes, because Thebes is where the Amen priesthood had their complete power and control. So he said, you know, A, you're all fired. Good, Annie, wake up please. And B, I'm moving my capital city. And most academics think that his capital city was virgin territory, but it wasn't. And we went there and we saw his mindset of what was going on with this. And he built his capital city, which was called Akhenaten, which means the dawn of Aten. Yeah, basically the dawn of Aten, or the rebirth of Aten. So he didn't build it in a virgin area. He actually built it on a megalithic site. So again, he knew that the ancient ones were incredible builders, that he probably was part of that lineage. So in order to rebirth the ancient culture, he took it back to an ancient location. So very complex man, but unfortunately, this is what supposedly Akhenaten looked like, and this is what it looks like today. The Amen priesthood destroyed the entire city, and they probably also murdered Akhenaten, Nefertiti, and the 6 daughters, trying to destroy the bloodline. And Stephen Mailer believes that Tutankhamun was not his son, probably his nephew, and he was kept alive because he wasn't in the direct line, so they could use him as a puppet. His original name would have been Tutankhaten, but the priest forced his name back and said, no, Aten, it doesn't exist anymore. We've killed your uncle and the family, so you are going to be called Tutankhamun, because we're taking the Amen principle back. We're taking darkness back. And then he was used for a while, and then met with an accident, and was killed off. And it's also believed that his tomb and his treasure were not his tomb and his treasure, because he suddenly dies, and then the artisans are whacking out all these gold jewelry and masks and stuff. That was probably the Amarna family's treasure that their devotees removed from their sacred city before the Amen priesthood were able to enter, because the Amen priesthood would have taken any of the gold and silver artifacts and melted them down to destroy the fact that they existed, and also the reason why his tomb was found cluttered, like not neatly organized, was because they basically had to shove the stuff in there and seal it off before it was discovered. And it could be, my belief is that it could be the only great treasure of the pharaohs. It isn't necessarily true that all of the others were buried with masses of treasure that was plundered. You know, it may be, but it may not be, because his is the only one that was ever found intact. So this is Amarna today. These are the sad artifacts, and these columns are made out of fiberglass. That's how badly the place was destroyed by them. All you find there is rubble. You know, you find little bits of artifacts, but they smashed everything. They didn't just deface, they ground everything down to nothing so that his name could not be found. You'd find part of it here, part of it over there. They wanted to obliterate his existence. So he's a hero. And this is Stephen. I love the man. Very obstinate, but he had studied Akhenaten for like 40 years, and he had never been to the capital city. So when we went there with him, he was in complete awe. And what he's doing is he's worshiping Akhenaten.
He also has his hands in the sun rising on the
Exactly.
horizon.
What he's pointing to is where winter solstice is.
It's where the sun would rise from when you're
Yeah,
standing at
where the sun would rise. So again, that's how Akhenaten chose the site. This cleft in the mountains So the sun would rise perfectly there, showing the rebirth every day as a reminder of the lineage. And so we went there and we found megalithic stuff. So he knew that this was an ancient site and he wanted his site built on an ancient site. He didn't build it on a sterile, let's choose a space over there. He knew that there was an ancient place where he could rebirth the ancient Aten concept. There's Alex Mott. So yeah, there are these major chambers and staircases carved into the bedrock, which could not have been done by the dynastic Egyptians. This is an inheritance of some of the stuff we saw today, so dating back many, many thousands of years. Very few people visit this site, but it's well worth going to if Akhenaten interests you. And of course, this is one of the depictions with the two of the daughters with elongated heads. You notice that it's not intact. The left-hand side on the top has been broken. Every artifact has been defaced. But this is where people get this idea. They go, well, they both look like they have elongated heads, but is that actually the case? The problem is that since Akhenaten and Nefertiti were murdered, they were probably also subjected to what happened to Osiris, where he was cut up into 42 pieces and spread to different parts of the world so that supposedly he couldn't come back to life. That's what the Amen priesthood probably did to him as the severe punishment, that his soul could never return. And that's why his mummy has never been found, and Nefertiti's has never been found. Zahi Hawass, in his audacious nature, of course, during his tenure, when something interesting didn't happen for a period of time, he would make a sudden discovery. So he would discover that he found Akhenaten, or he discovered that he found Nefertiti, but serious academic research, which has been done after his pronouncements, has said, we don't know. And we doubt if these are who you say they are. But that's why I don't want to shake his hand. I don't hate him. It's just he's a passé individual. Enjoy your limelight and whatever, but you've done more to corrupt the ancient culture of this country than improve it. So again, we have these portrayals. Why would you have the daughters of Akhenaten portrayed with elongated heads if they didn't have them? And this is another depiction like that. And my belief, this is what Tutankhamun probably looked like. So compare that, which is artistic, with that, which is based on his actual skull. So you see his cerebellum is a bit larger than normal, but it's nothing like that. So my belief is that what Akhenaten was doing was, again, because he was a disciple of the mystery schools, he knew that the ancestors could very well have looked like that. So again, in the rebirthing process of bringing back the Aten time period, he probably said to the sculptors, a little bit more to my daughter's head, please, because she is the personification of what was in the past. So it's unlikely they actually looked like that. And we don't have the skeletons to say yes or no. This is his sarcophagus, and the kind of gray areas that you can see compared to the pink are the actual remains of the sarcophagus. They bashed that thing, they destroyed it. So anyway, that's the Akhenaten aspect of this. And now we're moving into Peru. This is a secret photograph I took in the Ica Museum of different shapes of skulls that are found in the Baracus area. And curiously, all the skulls, except for the Baracus ones, that are found in Peru and Bolivia are found on this line called the Path of Viracocha, which is an energetic line where you find all the megalithic work in Peru and Bolivia are on this energetic line. That ties into what Patricia will get much more deeper into in terms of the earth grid system and energy moving through stone. And that's likely the reason why stone like granite and basalt were used by the ancient ones. It wasn't simply because it was hard and would last a long time. They're energetic stones. So if you send energy through them, whether it's natural through the earth or artificially, then you get an enhancing of energy in those locations. So this is just another depiction of where the path of Viracocha. So the oldest culture that's known to have had elongated skulls are the Chinchorro, found on the north coast of Chile. And they were mummifying their dead more than 8,000 years ago. Nobody has any idea where these people came from. There's no real serious DNA study of them being done. But as we travel along this path of Viracocha, we keep encountering these cultures with elongated heads, and that's something I'm still researching. But this is one of them. It's an example of cranial deformation. And this is another one. This is maybe cranial deformation, maybe not, because our nurse here can tell you that there's only so much you can do to alter the shape of a baby's head, where if you try to do it in an extreme fashion, you will kill the child. So as we travel along the path, this is the mountain called Tunupa, and in caves in the back, we find mummies of nobility with cranial deformation or head binding. And this is another example. You see the flattening of the back of the skull, and then the flattening of the forehead? That's deformation. That's a process of putting hard materials on the front and the back and binding it, and gradually over the course of about 2 years, once the skull totally calcifies, then the binding comes off and the skull retains that shape for the rest of the person's life. But it's not, it's nothing compared to the depictions of Akhenaten's daughters. And then we have Seropotisi, which is on this line, and more elongated skulls are found there. And this is an extreme example. This is from a culture called the Wankarani. And the cranial volume of this appears to be more than normal. So this could be an example of someone who genetically had an aspect of being born different from what we look like. And also around Tiwanaku, this is one that was actually found on private property, but you see the enormous length of it horizontally. This looks very much like the Amarna family. Unfortunately, this one was stolen before we could DNA test it. And also on Lake Titicaca, examples like that. This is probably cranial deformation. This one's kind of different. This is from Lake Titicaca. It's about a 2-year-old child. We're hoping to DNA test this one in the future. And also, again, where you find megalithic sites like Silustani, which is where these towers are. You see examples of skulls with slight deformation. And in the highlands of Peru. And this little skeleton is called Waiki. And we've taken at least 20 medical professionals to the little museum where it's located, and none of them can figure out what it is that they're looking at. They say, the skull is the size of the torso, so that's not cranial deformation. One Australian nurse who has spent 30 years in a maternity hospital, all she deals with are mothers and babies. The only mantra she kept saying over and over as she looked at this is, that's not one of us, or that's not like us. Yeah, and Sharon can.
Yeah.
So here we're looking at a genetic anomaly.
It's weird.
Oh, it's weird.
Person.
Yeah. It has 2 sets of ribs less than what we have. The rib cage appears to be upside down.
And
sorry?
your occipital, where the spine goes in.
Yeah, the occipital plate, which is in the back, is higher than
Isn't that
normal.
the one where it's kind of towards the middle, it's not so much in the back?
And also this suit, like we have a suture line coming across this way, and then one coming back that way. And this suture line is way up over here. So you can't bind a skull and make the suture line move. No, you can't. So you're looking at, Waiki is a genetic anomaly, and luckily she was part of the DNA testing, and we were able to get the mitochondrial. Her mother was Native American, but her father was out of this world. God knows what her father was, but we're hoping to do more DNA testing of her, because she's one of the extreme examples of a curiosity. Now, her fontanelle, which is that little gap, was not closed when she died. And so if she was Homo sapiens sapiens, she would be about 22 months old, or maybe 2 years old. So that's typical of Homo sapiens sapiens. But look at the size of her eye sockets, at least 50% larger than normal. So this is what when somebody says, we're looking at a genetic hybrid, it's extreme things like this you're looking at as characteristics that you can't explain away as a disease or again, cranial deformation. And the dentition has been looked at by many dentists, and they say the dental development is that of an 8 or 9-year-old. So it is very likely that Waiki is a hybrid of some kind, whether Homo sapiens sapiens, we don't know what, but something. She's a very curious little being. And this, she was found in a royal cemetery, and this 15-year-old was found buried there as well. So the nobility were buried in a different place, obviously, than the commoners. And that's, of course, the case with the Inca and the Baracus and other cultures. The nobility had their own cemetery, and then the commoners were buried just in different places. And then in Cusco, we find anomalous skulls too. These were excavated at a structure called the Coricancha, and they're labeled at being specifically from 1400 and I think 58 BC, or AD, sorry. But you ask the curator, have these been radiocarbon tested or carbon-14 tested? He said, no. Then how can you establish the date? Well, we can't. Then how can you establish the culture? Well, we can't. So this is what you find commonly in museums. They'll simply put a label on something without any evidence, and that's what we'll see in the Cairo Museum, some hysterical examples of lost ancient high technology that are mislabeled. This is a 2-year-old from Cusco, and this is likely not cranial deformation because of just the sheer volume of the skull. Like, this is way beyond simply flattening the back and front. It's got compound curvature to it. So this isn't putting boards on and flattening a head. This likely is an individual who was born genetically with this skull shape. And then when we go to Ollantaytambo, which is one of the great sites, the quarry, which is on the top of the mountain and behind, the skeleton you see on the right, notice the size of its skull and compared to the other ones that are there. The volume is at least, the internal volume is at least 20 to 25% larger than Homo sapiens sapiens, and you can't increase the volume of someone's head. It's genetically programmed for the suture lines to come and join together. You can alter the shape. It's like a potter with a potter's wheel. Before the clay totally sets, you can alter the shape a little bit, but you're not altering the volume. And it's the same thing with the human skull. You can't change the volume. And just there's so many examples in Peru, much more than any other part of the world. This is a baby. And this is another megalithic site near Andahuaylas.
No, it's in Ayacucho.
Sorry?
Ayacucho.
Oh, Ayacucho, sorry. And you see, especially the one in the center, notice its cone, like vertical cone shape compared to the other ones. And there's a direct correlation between the extreme elongated skulls and brain surgery. So part of that was due to the fact that the original inhabitants of the Baracus area were likely genetically different from the Native American people, which I'll show. But as the nobility, who were small in population, were forced to breed with normal people, otherwise, they'd wind up with genetic effects occurring. If you've seen the movie Deliverance and the banjo player on the doorstep kind of thing. So there's a direct correlation between brain surgery and the elongated skulls. And among the Baracus, there was a study of 240 elongated skulls that had trepanation done to them and survival, as in years after the surgery, was more than 50% of a supposed primitive culture on the coast of Peru. And just more examples here. Now we're moving into the Baracus culture, which is the most fascinating. That's why I study them, because no academics are studying the Baracus because they're afraid of them. But this was on display in a little museum at a village called Waitora. So these three mummies were on display, and Irene and I went back 4 months ago, and they're no longer on display. And we asked the curator, why are you taking them off display? And he said, well, for preservation purposes, we put them in cardboard boxes in the basement. The real reason is because I spread this all over the internet. And because they're anomalies, medical people were visiting the museum to look at them. So you see, here's an example. This is probably a 4 or 5 year old, and the skull is the size of the torso. And notice, again, the compound curvature. And another major characteristic is this bump here on the forehead. That seems to be a natural characteristic. But you see, this is not a head-bound person. And I asked the curator, what culture is that? He said, Baracus. So that's quite high in the highlands of Peru. So the Baracus weren't just on the coast, they actually had quite a spread out civilization. And this again is just detail of the head. You don't see flattening in the back of the skull, and it appears to me to be natural looking. But these are the most famous ones that are on display, especially the one on the left. That's the one that's labeled as Nephilim, or Anunnaki, or hybrid, or God knows what. But the largest elongated skulls in the world are found in a 10-hectare area in Peru, in Baracus. That's it. We learned that because of local connections, and our friend Senior Salvador, who's a retired tomb robber, and believe me, you have to get involved in this when you're in Peru if you want to obtain or look at artifacts, because the Huaquero tomb robbers know more about the ancient cultures than the archaeologists do, because they know what things are worth on the market. So I said, so he said, yeah, they're all from this very specific spot. And I said, well, how do you know that? He said, well, because I'm the one who sold them to the museum. The archaeologists didn't go and excavate these. The Huaqueros took them to the museum and said, do you want to buy them? And then the archaeologists say, well, where are they from? Well, they're from kind of in the Chongos area. Well, where specifically? No, if you want more, we'll dig more up for you. So only about 10 people on the planet know the exact location, and Irene and I are 2 of them, because we paid Senior Salvador to take us. And this is Senior Juan Navarro's museum with 45 elongated skulls. Most of them are cranial deformation, but the reason why we have 45 of them is that then we can show people, this is what a natural skull looks like, this is what cranial deformation looks like. So we start with the natural skulls, and then over the course of time, mixing with normal people, genetically the characteristics of the normal Homo sapiens sapiens starts to take over, the skulls start to shrink. So in order to maintain the look of the nobility, you have to start binding them. So this is where Baracus is located. It's the largest natural bay on the coast of Peru. And it's very likely that they were seafaring people, probably from a heritage that goes back, because the totora reed grows in Baracus, and with totora you can build little boats, or you can build ships 400 feet long if you want to. And also, natural cotton grows in the area and has done for 8,000 years. So you have totora to build the boat, and you have cotton to make the sails. And some of the little hints that we get about that is the Baracus people loved the spondulus shell for making jewelry, and spondulus is only found on the coast of Ecuador. So you didn't have a trading system by land going from Ecuador all the way down to Baracus, because the wind at Baracus, 80% of the time, blows north to Ecuador. So if the Baracus built a ship, they could naturally sail north and then do trading, and then 20% of the time the wind shifts and blows back south again. So they'd go back home. And there was only one big bay, which is their home. This is called the Candelabro, and it's located just to the right-hand side of the bay. So there's a lot of debate as to what it means, and Senior Juan, I think, came up with a very bright insight. You know, some people say, well, it was done by pirates or whoever, but he said that's the Southern Cross in reflection. And the Southern Cross rises directly behind the Candelabro. And the Southern Cross has been used for thousands of years by seafarers because depending upon where the Southern Cross is vertically in the sky, it tells you exactly where you are. That's why the Polynesians would use certain stars, like the Hawaiians used a star called Hokulea. When they would reach the equator, all of a sudden Hokulea would appear just on the horizon. And then when Hokulea was 20 degrees up, which is that measurement with your hand, that means you're very close to Hawaii. So, anyway, the story goes on and on. That's why I'm writing a book about it. That's why I'm writing the first book about the Baracus. But there are different head shapes, again, related to the different levels and time periods. So this is from the Chongo Cemetery. So these are probably the oldest elongated skulls. And again, you see the complex shape. Then later on, you get this shape, which is flattened in the forehead, and it is more of a swept back look. And then this is the end phase of the Baracus. This is where it's simply cranial deformation. The cranial volume has dropped by 25%. And then this is the terminus of their culture. Because most academics believe that the Nazca people moved in and blended with the Baracus culture and developed a new culture. But my evidence is showing that the Nazca invaded and caused genocide with the Baracus, because when the rise of the Nazca occurs, the natural red hair of the Baracus disappears and the elongated skull tradition disappears. So this is what this is cranial deformation, and that's classic Baracus. The difference is massive. And this is one of the Baracus as compared with a normal Homo sapiens sapiens. The amount of work to alter the shape doctors say is impossible. The baby would be dead at a certain part of the process of doing it, because you're also altering the shape of the brain, and that means that it can't be done. And that's why it's not an archaeological question, it's a medical question that we're looking at. So this is what our skulls look like, all 7 billion Homo sapiens sapiens. These are the two sutures forming this T shape, but the classic Baracus do not have the parietal suture. And medical professionals who look at that say that's impossible. But what does happen is over the course of time, which this individual is showing, is you see that the suture is starting to disappear. That's because the older you get, the more calcification begins to occur. But with the parietal or sagittal suture, which is missing in this one, what happens is as the calcification continues, it creates a peak. So you do see this ridge line where the suture was, but it simply doesn't exist with these people, which means the whole hip shape of the female has to be different in order to accommodate an elongated skull coming through the birth canal. And then we have what are called foramen in different parts of your face, like the mental foramen are here, and they're for blood and nerve flow to come out, because your spinal cord's back here. In order for proper blood flow to the surface of the face, you have to have genetically these two holes, so the nerves can come out and the blood can come out and feed the face. In the back of the Baracus skulls, there are two holes, which are not common in Homo sapiens sapiens. And the function of those, again, were probably because genetically the skull was longer, so to feed the back of the skull, nature produced those two foramen. So I've been taking the entire process of this one, like I do with everything, it's one step at a time, incremental. I don't leap from A to B, I'm working my way to B. But that is a genetic characteristic which shouldn't be there. And then also this, which, Sharon, what's this bone called here? No, where the arrow's pointing, this, I can't remember. Anyway, this is where major muscles of your neck connect to your skull, which allows us to move like this and that. It's much more highly developed on the Baracus, suggesting that the more muscles are there because the skull naturally wants to move backwards like that. So that means you need more muscle in order to be able to correct that. So that's another genetic characteristic. Then also, this is called the Foramen Magnum. And you can see, this is where your spinal column enters your skull. And you see it's at the perfect balance point of our skull, so that naturally our skull, you don't exert effort in order to keep your head up. But in the Baracus, and this is a recent discovery, the Foramen Magnum is 1.5 centimeters back. It's as far back as is possible. That's not something you could do with binding, and now that's been shown by a number of physicians and chiropractors, because if you try to bind the neck in order to move the foramen magnum back in a baby, it would be dead in 5 minutes. So this is another genetic characteristic, and at this point, when we did the DNA release, the 2 doctors we had and also the chiropractor that we had, they said this phenomenon by itself makes these people, at the minimum, Homo sapiens sapiens parasi. So they're a subspecies of human, at the minimum. And then this, again, this is the killing field which terminated the Baracus people. We found about 50 cranially deformed skulls, each one which had a blow to the head. So this is like a mass grave. The royal Baracus were always buried individually or in family mausoleums. And many people don't know that most of the so-called Nazca system of geoglyphs and lines were created by the Baracus culture, not by the Nazca. Nazca has about 30 large geoglyphs, but there's an area between Baracus and Nazca which has 1,600. But they're much smaller in size, but that's the work of the Baracus culture. And the astronaut was made by the Baracus, and he's waving up into the air. So those who like an alien connection, there's one of your possible hints. And this is other stuff these are other geoglyphs they did in the area called Palpa. If you ever want to fly over the Nazca lines, don't do it from Nazca, do it from the city called Ica. If you fly from Nazca, it takes 30 minutes. It takes 5 minutes to get there, 5 minutes to get back, so you have 20 minutes to see. If you fly from Ica, it takes an hour and a half. So you see the whole system. And this is the ceremonial city that was built by the Baracus culture. It's actually the largest ceremonial adobe city on the planet. Very seldom visited and not very well known. So what the Nazca did is they used the elongated skulls of the Baracus for divination, because the reason why they invaded the Nazca land, or the Baracus land, was the area was starting to become desert very gradually due to climate change. So the Nazca were forced out of their homeland to the north, and they moved into the lush agricultural land of the Baracus, wiped out the Baracus nobility who were experts at agriculture, and then the Nazca basically wiped themselves out by 500 AD because they didn't have the advanced agricultural skills of the Baracus were decimated with the Baracus themselves. So they used their skulls for divination at the end, desperately hoping that the rains would come back. And this is an effigy of what an elongated Baracus skull looked like. And this is, again, one of the natural Baracus elongated skulls. The hair is auburn red, genetically. It's 30% thinner than Native American hair, and it's naturally wavy. So hair experts that have looked at the Baracus hair say these were Caucasian people. The Caucasus is a fair distance from the coast of Peru. And then this is a comparison between, on the left you have a 1-year-old normal human Homo sapiens sapiens baby, and on the right side you have an 18-month-old Baracus. Look at the difference in scale. And that one was born, unfortunately, we had a mold made of it, and the guy who did it, Joe, had to spray an adhesive, or actually a silicone film on it so that the mold he made would come off. And unfortunately that wrecked the hair because that baby was born with strawberry blonde hair 2,000 years ago. And this is the god of the Baracus, and the god of Baracus is depicted with red hair. And he's called Khan, from which we get Khan Tiki. And multiple examples in different cemeteries of these ancient people with genetically red hair. Usually auburn, but occasionally blonde. And this is not the result of time or contact with chemicals or anything. This is genetics. So all Native American people, especially from Mexico down to the southern tip of South America, are supposed to be, those that are 100% Native American, are supposed to be of 4 haplogroups. Haplogroup is your genetic ancestry. So these people were either A, B, C, or D, because all of their ancestors crossed the Bering Land Bridge 12,000 plus years ago, or so the theory states. But when we did the initial study of the Baracus DNA, we did 3 individuals. This is the baby again. The baby turned out to be actually U2E1, which is located in the Caucasus Mountains and the Black Sea, and also in Scandinavia. But the problem is you have to find out, and Dr. Carl will discuss this more, because this is a map of one haplogroup called T2. The darker the color, the higher the concentration. But you can see, in the case of T2, it's Norway, and it's the Black Sea, it's in Italy. But where's the origin point? Where's the commonality? Is what you have to look at. So the first results we got were quite bizarre because T2 is from all over Europe and parts of Russia. And then with this one, this is H1, which is located in the Black Sea area, but also Scotland and Scandinavia. And then the baby was H2A. And the highest concentration of that is the Caspian and Black Sea. And so when we got those results, it's like, what the hell is going on here? You know, how does this work? But only sampling 3 individuals is not a scientific study because you have this big genetic spread. But that's why we were able to get someone to donate $150,000 to do the actual DNA testing. But the process took 3.5 years because since I blab on the internet way too much, but I love it, this information went around the planet like spontaneously, and then people were misquoting me and saying aliens are found in Baracus and all this kind of thing. And I'm just saying the genetics are pointing to Europe for some bizarre reason. And so that's, we had to wait for that to calm down. And then we went to ICA in order to get somebody from the Ministry of Culture to let us do the study, the DNA study. Because you can't simply take samples and put them in an envelope of a 2,000-year-old individual and mail them out of the country. This is pre-Columbian artifact. So you have to go through the Ministry of Culture. And so we went to the Ministry of Culture in ICA, to the director, and she said, just put them in the mail. I don't want to know about this. And I said, but isn't that illegal? And she said, I don't care. I'm not doing the paperwork on this. And I went, you sure? Will we get in trouble? She said, no, you won't get in trouble. But as soon as our critics, if they found out that we did that, then the hammer would come down on us. So we found Ruben, who's a high-ranking archaeologist at ICA, And we said, would you like to do this DNA study? And he said, well, they've already compared the Baracus with the Nazca. The Baracus transitioned into the Nazca. And I said, what haplogroups did they find? And he said, B. That's Native American. I didn't tell him about what we found. So I said, well, answer me 2 questions. One, why did the Baracus have red hair? And he said, I don't know. And I said, well, red hair is not from this part of the world. And he said, I know. And I said, okay, where did the Baracus originate? And he said, I don't know. And I said, oh, well, would you like to find out? Would you like to head a study? And he said, okay. But it took 3 years to get the paperwork, to get the okay for the lab people to come down from the US, take the samples and get them out of the country. 3 years. And as soon as the samples were out of the country, we got a note from the Ministry of Culture that said, you have 45 days to give us the results. And our response in a very nice way was, screw you. So it took like 8 months, and we finally got the results of studying 18 different skulls with 58 samples. So that's a big sample. It went to 3 different labs, and it cost more than $100,000. And again, the commonality, the haplogroups that turned up again, with 4 of them, 4 samples out of the 58, we got B, which is Native American of, coast of Peru. But all the other samples came up with H, again H, H2, H2A came up, which is the Caspian Black Sea area, and also J1B1, which is from the Black Sea and the Caspian area, and then K, which is from the Black Sea and the Caspian area. So that seems to be the commonality at this point. You had migration of people from that part of the world. Also, the largest elongated skulls in the world are found on the coast of Peru at Baracus and the Black Sea and the Crimea. There are very few photographs available on the internet, but I've been able to compare them. They're almost identical. So clearly there was a migration. But the question is why? Quite often migration happens because you have a relatively isolated group of people, maybe of high spiritual level, who are invaded by people of a lower level, and then those people are forced to flee. So this is what I'm working on now. But these are skulls that have been found in Crimea, especially look at the one on the left, and the one, these two are from Crimea. Notice the one on the right has a suture coming down its forehead. So that's a suture that shouldn't be there. That's another anomaly we find in Baracus. So that's a genetic characteristic again. It's an extra suture. And this baby that died about 2,000 years ago, which is contemporary with Baracus, was found in Crimea. The skull is almost the size of its torso, so we have that relationship again. And so this is the theory I'm working on, that they, rather than, if they were escaping, rather than heading west, which is where you would hit Turkey, which would be a high population of people, these people probably wanted to avoid anybody. So they may have gone into the Red Sea area, which is desert, and then they could have caught, a lot of reed boats existed in the past in this area, so they could have built reed ships, and then taken the southwest monsoon current, heading eastward, went through the Philippines and Indonesia, and then caught the equatorial current, or countercurrent, that would take them to the coast of Ecuador, and then by waiting and timing it, wait for the 20% time when the wind blows directly south. And over the course of time, they would have found the giant Bay of Baracus with nobody living there, more or less, and then established their home there. This is a fetus that was found in the 19th century that could be Baracus. Again, you see the head is the size of the torso, and the teeth are developed in a fetus. This is one that we hope to DNA test from a little village in Lake Titicaca in Bolivia called Tani. The museum curator said we're allowed to do DNA testing. So we'll see about that one. That took me 3 years to find that skeleton. And this is the incredible story here because we happen to have a guy called Ken with us, and Ken wanted to see Puma Punku. So we spent the day at Puma Punku, and he said, I'm a physicist, I want to see what's, the nature of the stone. And so we did that, and so we had one more day, and I thought, maybe Ken will pay for us to go and find this, which I suck people into all the time. How'd you like to go and see this? It's like, that sounds interesting. So Ken paid for our little expedition to try to find the museum of Patapatani. We had Antonio Portugal, a Bolivian, and Eduardo, a Bolivian art driver. They had no idea where this place was. It took us 4 hours driving on the Altiplano to find the village. And then when we found it, we went into the museum and said, Ken said, oh, I'm also a radiologist. And a radiologist is the expert on human anatomy. So he looked at this one, and he said, that's not a human being, as in, it's not Homo sapiens sapiens. And then he looked at this one, again, the skull is the size of the torso. And he said, well, that's not a human being either. And I was blown away because this is the first time I'd ever seen a full skeleton. Normally we find the skulls, but because usually the skulls are thrown off to the side by tomb robbers because they're rummaging through the skeleton looking for gold and silver jewelry, I'd never seen one, and I was like, oh, I was in complete shock, and Ken was in complete shock, and we drove back to La Paz, which took 3.5 hours, and he and I did not utter a word because our brains were just going, oh. And then Ken said, when do you want to meet for dinner? And I said, I have to go to bed because my brain was fried from this experience. And so I said, let's have breakfast and think about what we were looking at. And then at breakfast he walked in, and this was the smart thing to do. At breakfast he walked in and he said, I'm 90% certain that was mother and baby, and both died during childbirth. So this baby would have been born with an extremely elongated skull. So this blows the paradigm that academics keep insisting that every example of an elongated skull is cranial deformation. And they were of royal lineage. And this, hopefully the sound will work with this. This is the most bizarre one. Oops. Oops.
And here we have a frontal view. Again, eyes, and you see the red hair.
Look at the shape of it.
You see the overall shape of the skull. Now, is this the result of cranial deformation or head binding? Because if it was only newborn, or possibly 3 months old, then that would not be enough time to do head boarding, which normally takes between 6 months and 3 years.
I had that in my possession for 3 hours, and I gave it back to the person who had it, who promised me I would be able to take samples for DNA testing. And then 3 days later, he sold it, and it's probably in Belgium. I will never forgive him for that. This is a banker in Spain.
Really?
And this, if you've heard of the Nazca mummies that were found, they're fake. This is the so-called Maria one. It's a composite of different body parts. You see, like it has 3 giant fingers.
Yeah.
They cut the baby finger and the thumb off, and they added the parts on, and then they coated it in this white clay stuff to hide what they were doing. So that's fake. And that's it. Thank you. Okay, time for cocktails. Oh, presidents?
Right, is there, out of the DNA DNA testing of the Baracus skulls,
Yeah.
was there any more Neanderthal genes?
No.
For DNA, was that?
None was found. No, and actually we used 3 labs. We contacted, there are only 10 labs in the world that can test 2,000-year-old DNA, like 10 maximum.
And
Most
even
of
so,
them,
like the mandible was slightly larger. Was that in all of the
yeah,
species?
yeah, that's another
Just
characteristic.
and the red hair.
And the red hair, and the holes in the back of the skull, and also one of the main things is the Foramen Magnum that's farther back, and there are also recent discovery. There are things called Foramen ovelli, which are located where your palate is, and that again is where nerve and blood flow comes through, which gives you the ability to have like our facial expressions. Those are non-existent in the Baracus. So the Baracus didn't have facial expressions. You know, talking alien-looking people, whatever people. But also we contacted all 10 labs, like including the Max Planck and whatever. Only 3 of them responded back. The other 7 wouldn't touch this with a 10-foot pole. Because unfortunately we said we want to test the Baracus skulls. We shouldn't have said, we're going to send you DNA. But the one at Lakehead University was like, wow, those are weird, we'll do that. So they were great. And then also one of the University of California labs, I can't name it, but the head geneticist there said, it's my laboratory, I can do whatever I want, I'll do it for you. And then the 3rd lab, refused to be identified, and we sent 58 samples out, and from the 2 labs that we were able to work with and correspond with, and we almost got a 50% result. So out of 40 samples that they had, we got 18, which is 40-something% of haplogroups identified. The other ones were too degraded, but that's almost 50%. The 3rd lab, which I will blackmail at some point in the future, were sent 18 samples, and they sent results back saying, we got nothing. We got no results back. So they're probably scared shitless of this. But I hold this information in my computer to use in future episodes. Just like some of you might know, we tried to do what's called Cosmogenic Testing of the stone of Puma Punku, because there are hundreds of thousands of bits of Puma Punku all over the place because they blew it up in the late 19th century. And we sent samples to the Purdue University. Again, only 10 labs in the world can do cosmogenic testing, which is measuring the amount of solar impact on exposed stone. And Purdue, the main man at the lab, said, yeah, I'll test that for you. And then when his upper authority found out where the stone was from, he said, you're not testing that. So that was blown out the door. And then the second one was a laboratory in France, and they said, yes, we have a result for you. And I said, well, what's that? And he said, well, I'll send you the age that we think the stone is in terms of when it was quarried, as long as you don't mention the name of the lab. I said, that's fine, I won't do that. And then he wrote back and he said, well, we're actually going to refund your money because we can't tell you what the age of the result is. And I wrote back and said, well, why is that? And he said, because the age we found cannot be different from what archaeologists state the age of Puma Punku is. So this is how deceitful science can be. If you try to nuance a paradigm out somewhere else,
Knowledge filtration.
they fight back, and that's why as well. Any academic that wants to do peer review of the Peru or of the Baracus DNA results will be sent the whole report for free by our head archaeologist Armando Gonzalez, but I don't think they want to touch it with a 10-foot pole. And that's why I decided, since we're in the internet age, I'll make 7 videos of the results, like one component at a time, and they've been seen 1 million times. This information belongs to us. It doesn't belong to academia. Academia can look at it if they want to and express their opinion, but it doesn't. the pipeline of information does not belong to them anymore, because they've been deceiving us too much, which is what we experience today, wandering around. And that's what part of this whole tour is that we're doing here is the same thing, is moving the paradigm into the world of the reality of what we're looking at, and not what we're being told to look at, and not what age we're told something is, because all of what we can do in the future is multidisciplinary. The domain of archaeologists or of history does not belong to archaeologists and anthropologists and historians. It belongs to geologists as well. It belongs to medical professionals as well. It belongs to stonemasons. Any discipline that wants to contribute should be allowed to do that, so we can develop a picture of the whole and not say, what does PhD so-and-so or what does Zahi Hawass have to tell us?
He's downstairs.
Zahi Hawass. So anyway,
They must be talking about me.
and that's what the late great John what's his name? John Anthony West. He fought that all his life. You know, the man was very brilliant. That's why he called them, you know, not all, but he called those that were trying to push back with nonsense quackademics. Anyhow, beer time.
Thank you, Brian.